Welcome to the Adam Smith Institute's webinar entitled What Next? We're going to discuss what happens after the pandemic is over. How do we restore our liberties and our economies? And of course, we have three very distinguished panelists joining us tonight. Peter Lilly is a member of the House of Lords, of course, former member of Parliament, and was indeed a cabinet minister in both. John O'Connell is the chief executive of the Taxpayers Alliance and has worked there since 2009. He is also chairman and president of the World Taxpayers Associations. Now, you'll notice this tax theme seems to come tonight. For Grover Norquist, our third panelist, is the founder and president of Americans for Tax Reform, which works to establish a simpler, flatter, and more visible tax system. He's one of the most influential activists in Washington and indeed was an advisor to both President Reagan and President Bush. I use chairman's privilege and I go first. And the format is that each of us speaks for under 5 minutes. And then we open it to questions from people tuning in. So let's begin. Well, to deal with the pandemic, the UK has shut down much of the economy and suspended the important liberties, such as freedom of association and the freedom to travel without approval. Now, the task after this is over is to make sure that none of these temporary sacrifices requires any permanent. It's not so much about restarting the economy as it is about allowing the economy to restart. There'll be a temptation for government to steer a recovery, to pick winners, to boost favoured sectors, or even just ones that are good at lobbying. This, of course, is the reverse of what should happen. A government should instead look at the factors that inhibit expansion and hold back economic growth and development, and indeed stop doing that. So there is talk of raising taxes to deal with the borrowing that's been necessary to fund the survival of businesses and jobs. Again, this is the reverse of what should happen. Taxes need to be cut, not raised. And borrowing should be dealt with by the method that has enjoyed the most success in the past, by allowing economic growth to increase the national wealth and enabling the state to take more revenue from low taxation than it could yield by raising taxes. At the Adam Smith Institute, we've identified and published a list of the taxes that work to thwart entrepreneurial activity and investment. High on that list, for example, is the factory tax. It doesn't allow firms to gain immediate tax relief on their current investment. Now, the scrapping of that tax would lead to just the flood of investment needed to generate expansion. And we should allow companies to bring back revenue earned overseas tax-free for up to 2 years in order to boost investment even more. There are others, of course, like raising the threshold for national insurance for both employers and employees, making it more attractive for firms to take on workers, and making work indeed more attractive for individuals. We drew up a blueprint called Winning the Peace, which I commend to our followers, and especially those of you who are in government and administration. Please feel free to crib from that and treat it as your handbook and instruction manual. Now, it's particularly important to let the hospitality and entertainment sector revitalize itself. It not only generates a huge number of jobs, it's also important for national morale. People need to feel that they can emerge from this and enjoy themselves again. And one way to let this happen is to relax and remove the rules and regulations that make it difficult and ones that impose unnecessary compliance costs. Let's start by opening beer gardens and street tables at cafes, and give automatic permission for new pubs to open on the sites where previous ones didn't survive. To enable firms to pull through and survive their loss of revenue, we should fast track a UK equivalent of the Chapter 11 rules in the US. We should let businesses continue to trade while going through insolvency restructuring. And we should finally scrap the restrictions imposed by Sunday trading laws. If our proposals read like a shopping list, that's because it is one. These are policies we think necessary, fundamentally to create the space and the opportunity for businesses to move. And we want government to put all of them into our shopping basket. And we're going to tick off the ones they do. We could boost housing, for example, by making it easier to turn surplus office space into new homes. We could give infant industries a lift by fast-tracking drone deliveries. And we could give approval for e-scooters. We could speed up approval for driverless vehicles to give us a lead in tomorrow's technology. But, you know, civil liberties for UK citizens are even more important than our economic opportunities. We've seen serious inroads into freedom, and it's important that we regain that ground. Some police forces have treated government guidelines and recommendations as if these were the law of the land. We need a firm lead from the Home Office to clarify the important difference between these two. We don't need the law in this country to tell us what we're allowed to do. That might happen on the continent, but over here, the job of the police is to tell us what we're not allowed to do. Everything else is ours. The restrictions on liberty put into place for the emergency must all be repealed. Now, some people are saying we should leave them in place in case they're needed again in future. If that happens, we can reimpose them in the future just as we did now, but we must get rid of them. It's a good opportunity, actually, to regain some of the ground for freedom that was lost before the pandemic. We might look to altering the laws about hate speech so that people are no longer reported to the police simply for insulting someone, or indeed for saying something people disagree with. We might stop the police from recording what they classify as hate incidents, even though no crime has been committed. And we might look at asking universities to sign up to a voluntary charter that guarantees freedom of speech on campus. And that the pernicious notice that if someone addresses a meeting, they're being given a platform. This is nonsense, and we should make sure that it remains nonsense. Now, it's quite an agenda to be starting out with, so let's hear what some of our distinguished speakers have to say. Can we start with Lord Lilly? Over to you, Peter. Would you like to make your contribution? How do we regain the lost ground?
Well, we do all the things that you have said we should do. But if we simply relax the regulations and the constraints at present as we should, and rely on people using their own discretion and common sense to avoid either contracting or spreading the virus, the economy will recover large measure of it. But there will be areas of the economy which will permanently have changed as a result of the COVID thing. People may travel less because they've learnt to use things like Zoom. They may live out of town and work at home, all that sort of thing. So there'll be a change in the pattern of demand, and we've got to liberate enterprise to take up that slack as rapidly as possible. So what should we do and what should we not do? Well, first of all, we should rely on the private sector rather than the public sector. And to release the power of the private sector, we should above all do everything in our power to speed up government regulatory decision-making where it affects enterprise. I mean, we've learned during the COVID crisis that actually governments sometimes, under great public pressure in a crisis, can take decisions in a fraction of the time they normally do. And we want that to become the norm across the government regulatory decision-making bodies without reducing standards. So ministers should first of all make it clear that it's job of regulators to give approval as speedily as possible, or at least to give a decision as speedily as possible without reducing standards. We should require all regulators to report at 6 monthly intervals on the time they've taken on average, and for the worst 10th of their decision-making times. We should require select committees to investigate each department of government and regulatory body to see how they're doing on this front. And we should particularly try and speed up decision-making in the construction industry. There are already some time limits on planning applications. If need be, they should be shortened.
Peter,
yep.
Might I just interrupt? Could you start your video, please? Could you click on the video?
I have to do that, do I?
Sorry, there you are. You've done it. Well done.
I've done it.
Continue.
Right. You don't want me to start again, do you? Or give me your...
Nope.
No.
We heard it, but we couldn't see you.
Oh, I see.
Continue.
Right. Right. So we need to speed up construction because that's both important in itself and has a dynamo effect on many other sectors. We should speed up decision making in ordinary planning, but secondary planning doesn't have time limits, and that needs to be speeded up, particularly on large projects. We should cut taxes where there are high marginal rates. Most of the high marginal rates went in the famous 1989 or 7 budget. And we had few left higher than 40%. But stamp duty, for example, is effectively at a very, very high percentage rate because although it's calculated on the value of the property, it's actually a tax on a transaction, on a change of ownership. And it's sometimes several 100% of the cost of that transaction. So we should reduce stamp duty and any other taxes we find that have high marginal rates. In other areas, we may choose to have tax holidays for a period of years or for certain projects to encourage people to bring forward investment during the period taxes will be low. We should obviously speed up the introduction of free ports and enterprise zones. What should we not do? Well, we shouldn't rely on the public sector. We shouldn't rely on large-scale government investment projects. They take years to get shovel-ready and they're rarely as productive as they should be when they are. Governments should not be in the business of picking winners. As Dieter Helm said, governments aren't good at picking winners, but losers are very good at picking governments, and we shouldn't create a field day for them. We shouldn't restrict the recovery to green projects, as some have suggested. Of course, if green projects are profitable and attractive for people to invest in, splendid, they should go ahead and be given permission as speedily as possible. But if we say you can't invest in things unless they meet some green agenda, we're inevitably restricting the amount of growth there will be in the recovery phase. We certainly shouldn't raise tax levels, even though we will face an inherited deficit and a larger level of debt. And we certainly shouldn't permanently raise the level of government spending. Essentially, we were dealing with a temporary problem. And temporary problems can be met by expanding debt and accepting a higher level of outstanding debt. It's permanent deficits that frighten markets and to cause them eventually to cease to lend. So we can, for a while, accept a higher deficit. Those, to my mind, are the key things we should do and shouldn't do. But I look forward to hearing what my colleagues come up with to add to this shopping list.
Peter, Peter, could I ask you, do you think we can accept a permanently higher level of debt? That permanent, we just renew it every few years when it matures and so on. Can we do that forever?
Well, there's a difference between debt and the deficit. You do, you know, but well, let's make that distinction. If we run a permanently high deficit, a deficit that's a higher proportion of national income than the rate of growth, then it will spiral out of control over time and add to the accumulated debt. Markets will see that coming, and well before it has got to a dangerous phase, they will withdraw confidence. If they can see that the debt, the annual deficit is declining and will soon get back to something less than the rate of growth, they will accept that. And the level of debt will then gradually, accumulated debt, which probably will go up above 100% of GDP for a time, will come down over time as the economy grows. We found that at the end of the war. We had, I think, an accumulated debt because of financing the war of something like 200% of GDP. And then over the next few decades of steady growth, it came down as a share of GDP and some of it was paid off. So the markets will accept it if they can see the deficit is temporary.
And it's growth that does it, not higher taxes.
Essentially, yes.
Excellent.
And the trouble with higher taxes is they often prevent the growth.
A brilliant way to introduce our next speaker, John O'Connell. John, you must turn on your video to make sure we can all see you as well as hear you. I will ask you now to contribute to this webinar, please. Go.
I am hoping, I'm clicking start my video, Madsen, so hopefully
Good. Sound. Very good.
I will just start by saying, part of the introduction text that was sent to me, an invitation to this event, which, thank you for having me, by the way, was about whether politicians will reach for tax rises or tax cuts in order to aid the recovery. And I think the real practical answer, obviously the one I would like, is tax cuts, but the one I fear is the sort of more likely one, which is tax increases. And it got me wondering of why that might be. Why do politicians and the commentariat quite often just reach for tax increases?
John, we can't actually see you. I wonder if you could click start video now.
I've tried a couple of times, I'm afraid. Okay, I'll continue to try and just continue with my point, saying that I was wondering why it is that the commentary
at the bottom left you have a thing which says video start. Stop video, start video. So if you could just press start, we can see you.
I have done that several times. I'm not sure what else to do. And I've been sent a prompt as well, which I've also clicked on.
Well, have you turned on your camera?
Yeah, it's on. I've just come off a Zoom call before this one, so I'm not sure what to.
Well,
shall I continue, or do you want to pass to Grover until I fix my issue?
That's a good plan. I will ask Grover if he's ready to take over now and give us the US and international perspective. But first of all, Grover must turn on his video. This is.
I am here and I'm hitting the. There we are. Okay.
We can see you. Grover, would you like to give us, please, the
Sure.
international and US perspective? How are we going to get out of this? What next?
Okay. Well, there's a very interesting debate in the United States. This is happening at the same time we have our presidential campaign for November 2020. The two parties are fairly evenly balanced, can be a very close presidential race, House race, Senate race, and they want to go in completely different directions. So each party is looking at the virus because it's the only thing they talk about on TV. You can't get on television or talk radio to talk about a separate subject. You have to talk about the virus, and then you can talk about other issues. But the Democrats are taking the position that we need larger government. We should have Medicare for all, which is the American word for government-run healthcare, national healthcare, monopoly run by the federal government on all healthcare issues. That would solve the problem, they say. Good news is 2-to-1, the American people think that if we'd had a government-run healthcare system, we would be worse off today than where we are. So that's helpful, but that doesn't stop the left from making that case. On the right, there's a very interesting thing that's been going on because we have a Republican Senate and president. This is the first crisis where the movement of the government was not immediately to raise taxes, create a new bureaucracy, create new laws to empower the state in various ways, but in point of fact, to deregulate. The problem we had with the Center for Disease Control was that they had a monopoly on testing for 6 weeks, and then they screwed it up. That was taken away from them, and now dozens of people can do tests, and testing isn't a problem anymore because it's not run by the government monopoly incompetently. The FDA said, oh, everything has to go across our desk and we need to test it at great lengths, and they said no. We actually just had a victory in the United States in the last 2 years where 44 states passed a law at the state level called Right to Try. And that says if you got a terminal disease and there's a medicine that the FDA admits is safe, but they're not yet willing to say it's effective, okay? But it won't kill you and you're dying anyway, but they want to spend 5 years looking to see if it's really effective. You might want to decide that yourself. The laws passed in the states, and now in Washington, almost unanimously, they said, you got a disease that will kill you. All they need to know is that the medicine won't kill you first, and you can use it, okay? That passed over the FDA's objections. And at our ATR, I run Americans for Tax Reform, the National Taxpayer Group. At our website, atr.org/rules, R-U-L-E-S, there are 550 different federal, state, and local rules and regulations that have been waived or abolished in the wake of the pandemic. It's easier to do telemedicine. It was illegal in many parts of the country. It is legal as a doctor in Massachusetts to also be a doctor in California. You don't have to go through some new test or some new rigmarole. And so they're expanding what nurses can do, what doctors can do, what you can do by telemedicine. All of these are now wrapped up in federal legislation where the Republicans are saying, let's make all these changes permanent. In the United States, because of prohibition on alcohol consumption, when we got rid of prohibition, we said, yeah, but states can come up with stupid rules. So unlike every other product where you can't do things that mess with interstate commerce, with alcohol you can. So there are many, many stupid rules at the state level on how you can get a drink and whether it's a cup and how it gets shipped to you and on and on and on. Many of those have been waived as well. So there's been a wave of deregulation, some of them critical, like getting the CDC not to have a monopoly on testing. They're now having about 6 companies are manufacturing vaccines that have not yet been approved. Companies think they work, but the FDA is going to take a few months to think about it. But when they do get their act together over at the FDA, we'll have millions and millions of the vaccine doses ready to go. And with federalism, which is one of the other advantages, is there are 50 states, some of whom are staying shut down. We'll see if that helps. We'll see if that actually slows down the disease. We'll see if it actually, what it does to the economy. And some of the states are going in the other direction of opening up. That's why we're opening up, because there are 50 states and you can try it 50 different ways. Even the D states, the blue Democratic states, which are apparently deliberately trying to sabotage the economy by keeping it closed, they get embarrassed because neighboring states are opening up. Illinois passed a law against leaving the state. Why? Because people are getting haircuts and going to the store and going to restaurants across the leaky borders. And they don't want people to have this taste. I mean, it's East German border guard stuff. I mean, it really is bizarre what the left is trying to do. But because if there was nothing to compare it to, if somebody said, well, it's different in Singapore, that doesn't work for the United States. What do you know, Singapore is different. But Illinois and Indiana are pretty reasonably similar, except one has a stupider government than the other. The other things that have moved forward quickly is almost all kindergarten through 12th grade kids took a semester off. They're in effect homeschooled. So while there are 2.5 million American children being homeschooled normally, we now have 40 million that have had a taste of homeschooling. 40% of parents say they're more likely to homeschool. That doesn't mean half the country is going to homeschool next year. But 40% said, not get these kids off my hands, but I'm more likely to homeschool. That is an incredible breaking up of the government monopoly on K through 12. Add to that universities. Almost every university has for the last half a year, this last semester, learned online. So you go on your computer. You don't go into a class with 100 or 50 or 1,000 students. You go online. Harvard and MIT and the University of Michigan all sent their parents a letter of the kids. We're not going to charge you for food because you can eat at home. We're not going to charge you for your dormitory because you're not living here anymore. But you know what we are? We're charging the exact same amount for a Harvard education online that you got when you were paying for the $400,000 per class Elizabeth Warren teaching at Harvard Law School. So all of the entire establishment intelligentsia universities have told Americans online university is every bit as valuable as going into a class with 1,000 people or 50 people and being close to everybody else, being close to people making $400,000 a year pretending to teach you. I'm not sure that the present costs of university can continue when that many 10 million Americans have tasted online, know what it is, and years from now, people hiring, they'll never think that an online education isn't real, that it's somehow lesser than going to university, because they've done it themselves for some part of the time. The other debate, should we raise taxes or what? Biden's running for president. You may not see him a lot. He lives in the basement. But Joe Biden used to be vice president, used to be a senator, used to clearly. But he's wants a $3.4 trillion $3.4 trillion tax increase over a decade. That's 3 times as much as Hillary Clinton campaigned on and lost in 2016. He wants to increase the tax on a middle-income family, center middle-income family of 4 would pay $2,000 more every year in taxes. A single mom, middle-income single mom, single dad, $1,300 increase over each year going into the future. Biden has called for raising the corporate tax higher than communist China's. We're at 21, communist China's at 25. He wants it, depending on what day it is, either at 28 or 35. He said 35 a lot. He also said 28 once. Always higher than communist China. So there's a very clear discussion. So far, we have not in the United States passed any permanent, stupid, damaging thing. We spent some money. We passed a couple laws that last a couple of months, but no permanent damage.
Grover,
yes.
Grover, I have a trivial question and a serious question.
Okay.
The trivial question, is that the federal government behind you that's burning in the background?
This is not Madison's White House. This is Burning Man.
Okay. The serious question is America going to end up more regulated or less? Are you going to get federally funded and organized national healthcare as a result of this? Or are you going to get more reliance upon private sector, independent, spontaneous contributions to solving the problem?
Right now, for now until January, we are moving in the direction of more openness, more competition among the states, devolution of power from Washington to the states and to individuals. And the vaccines are being invented by companies, not the CDC. This all changes if a Democrat gets elected president, won the House and Senate, then they will tell history differently. It will be more difficult given the history of now and then. But I think that Trump is in a better position because we are moving towards deregulation, which means the economy will be going gangbusters going into the election rather than just, if we'd been raising taxes, it would have been slow. The real recovery in this country doesn't start until August 1st. That's the day when the extra unemployment, $600 a week that you got for losing your job from the federal government on top of your state unemployment, that has kept some people from going back to work. 61% of Americans make more money on unemployment than their job. That was something the Democrats put into a bill and was foolishly agreed to by the Secretary of Treasury. That will not continue after August 1st. That's when everyone goes back to work.
We're going to test, Grover, we're going to test you on that.
Yes,
The day after the US election, I'm going to have 2 glasses ready for you. One is champagne, the other is deadly nightshade. And depending on the result, you can choose which one to drink. Now it's time for our final contributor. John, have you turned on your video? Yes, we can see you. John, would you like to take over and tell us about taxation in the future?
Yeah, thank you. Sorry about the earlier technical glitch. I had started by saying that will politicians reach for tax increases or tax cuts in the recovery? And unfortunately, the answer is usually to look to increase taxes. And I wanted to explore sort of what be. And an article on the BBC I saw recently had the headline, Saudi Arabia to triple VAT to help the economy. And, you know, the specifics of the Saudi Arabian economy aside, what was clear is that the person writing the article confused the public finances and the economy. And when they talk about helping the economy, they actually mean more money for the public finances when they're 2 completely different things. It reminded me of when I first started at the TPA, maybe 10 years ago, a little bit more, when Labour politicians at the time used to talk about tax cuts as taking money out of the economy, which was bizarre to me. But what they clearly meant was the public finances. So that conflation between the economy and the public finances is quite prevalent. What it means is that in a situation like now, where the OBR just the other day said that fuel duty receipts are down 48%, alcohol duty is down 31%, although people are trying to up that with drinking at home heroically. Stamp duty land tax is down 43%. Receipts for air passenger duty are down by 90%. So with all of those gaps in the public finances, a lot of people in the commentariat say that what you need to do is to therefore tax more. Of course, that can just prolong the pain and make it worse, and mean that we actually get, have a much longer slump than we otherwise would. And then we saw the leaked Treasury report, which said that tax increases were likely. It talked about some extreme examples of 5%, 5 percentage point increase on income tax. But the more sort of whispers with substance are talk of a mansion tax again, a wealth tax, and taxation on pensions, which are sort of the three that come up at every single fiscal event. But the principle remains the same, that introducing these new taxes when the economy is on its knees won't help at all. We should be looking to actually cut taxes. And of course, if one looks at these things dynamically, as opposed to the usual HMRC ready reckoner, which is if you increase a tax by 1%, then you increase revenue by X pounds. Taxes work much more dynamically than that. And the Treasury themselves, during the period of the coalition government of 2010 to 2015, they modeled this themselves on both fuel duty and corporation tax, and found that the freezing of fuel duty brought in more money, and the cuts to corporation tax also brought in more money. So hopefully we need to see a bit more of that kind of thinking in the Treasury, rather than the simple static scoring that we're used to. Public spending, I mean, I think we all probably have to accept it's going to go up. I think it was going to before COVID anyway, with Boris Johnson's levelling up agenda. But perhaps we need to institute that old golden rule that spending increases must be below that of GDP growth. So therefore, the public spending can't increase more quickly than the broader economy. So a lot of that is wishful thinking. It does seem to be accepted that tax increases are on the cards, but we'll of course be doing what we can to make the case against it. And your wonderful report of the ASI has many good suggestions, the factory tax being probably my favorite in terms of getting investment going in the economy. I'm also the chairman of the World Taxpayers Association. I was interested talking to a colleague from New Zealand just recently about the differences in the public debate that we're having at the minute. And there seems to be an acceptance in the UK that debts and deficits are something to not particularly worry about. That's also true of people on the centre right. They seem to not worry too much about debts and deficits in the short to medium term. I'm not so, I'm much more concerned about that. And the debate in New Zealand is actually slightly different. They're able to talk much more openly and certainly more angrily about increases to the national debt. Perhaps the big difference is that they went into the crisis with debt of much lower levels than ours and a sort of slightly healthier balance sheet than we have. And they're also much more open to talking about public sector pay cuts over in New Zealand, which is interesting because part of the Treasury report that was leaked, of course, talked about a public sector pay freeze, which made lots of people, sort of jaws drop, considering there's lots of frontline workers putting their lives at risk and all the rest. But it seems to be a much more live debate, and the Prime Minister herself instituted a 25% pay cut for ministers. So that suggests to me that there's we're quite open to private sector austerity here in the UK, but perhaps not so much public sector. And I think that we need to frame the argument that tax increases would be private sector austerity as a key argument for the recovery.
We've got a question from we have a question from David Middleton, Professor David Middleton. He says, Grover points out that competition between US states on regulation and taxation actually sounds like a good idea. Should the UK push much harder to let real tax and spend powers be delegated to the region so we could enjoy the same type of competition?
We've got one of the most centralized tax systems in the world, and all of the academic literature shows that a decentralized tax system is better for economic growth. So, academic theory says yes, but how does that work in principle? People will talk about reforms to council tax, for instance, and at present, council tax is based on valuations of properties in 1991 or 1993 or somewhere around that time, and it's quite iniquitous at the minute. But yeah, I would say that maybe a local sales tax, a local level, but giving local authorities the ability to raise their own money may make them more prudent when it comes to spending it, because it's very, very easy to spend grants when they're distributed to you, but you might be more prudent when you have to raise the money yourselves. And perhaps you'd look at sort of lower business rates in your area to attract some businesses to it, and a good, healthy bit of tax competition that we don't seem to have in the UK.
Right. We now move on to the questions that have been sent in, and they're pouring in at a fast rate. I'll tell you. Now, this one is from Justin Shasha, I think, to all panelists, and it basically says, should the Taxpayers Alliance, the ASI, and the others, should we be working to educate people about the Laffer curve? That we are in a dynamic economy, and you can't simply expect more revenue by raising the rates of taxation. Should we push much harder to make sure that knowledge of the Laffer curve is widely accessible and widely appreciated? Peter Lilly, I think I'm going to ask you to start on this. For Peter, you had experience of riding the Laffer curve when you were in the Treasury team of first of all Geoffrey Howe and then Nigel Lawson. Am I correct?
Correct, and even before that, actually, I wrote the speech which Geoffrey Howe gave before the 1979 election, saying we intended to cut the top rates of taxes. And I inserted in it the assertion that this would raise extra revenue, partly by stopping the brain drain, partly by stopping people investing abroad. They'd rather invest here and so on. The interesting thing was it got a very positive reaction. I can remember a letter coming in from the sixth form girls of school in Newcastle saying, yes, we're delighted you're going to do this. It will stop the Bay City rollers emigrating. And of course, it will stop lots of surgeons and architects and other people emigrating too. So if the sixth form girls in Newcastle can understand the concept once they're given it, I think it can be widely understood. The difficulty is, of course, we've since moved on from where we had very high rates of tax, and it was self-evident that they were actually going to raise less revenue than lower rates would. We, in the 87 budget, was it, reduced all top rates to 40% for most things. That's why in my remarks, I said we've got to look around for taxes which have very high marginal rates. The stamp duty is one. I think there are others, tariffs and taxes, which effectively are a high rate on the transaction on which they're levied. And they're the ones where you self-evidently get increased revenue. As far as the whole economy is concerned, the burden of tax probably also reduces its growth in less obviously identifiable ways. And we've got to get that over too.
Okay, Grover, I'm going to ask you next. Does the Laffer curve work in America? Can you persuade people that by lowering the tax rates, you can make more tax revenue and ride the growth curve instead of the high tax curve?
Yeah, people get it instinctively. If prices are lower, people will buy more of something, and taxes reduce the price of something, like hiring people, labor, or anything else that one would wish to invest in or buy. So it does reasonably well. The Democrats have to bend over backwards to try and pretend they don't see it. But in the history of the United States, when rates have come down, the economy has grown. When rates have gone up, 1929, the economy does poorly. And there's just a real, when you cut the capital gains tax, you get more capital gains revenue. It's happened again and again and again. Our friends on the left just try and ignore it. But it's worth reminding people, because the examples historically are there, and the examples in people's minds, and their own examples that, all of the, tennis players who left Sweden because of their high tax rates. People get the Beatles ended up in the United States. people realize that there is a movement of people and of capital. When communist China had a 25% rate, we had a 35% rate. Why were we surprised people invested more in China?
Okay, I'm going to ask John a question we've got in from Andrew Chalk, who asked about economic nationalism. You know, how can we promote the notion that free market stuff isn't dead and that economic nationalism, beggar my neighbor stuff, isn't the way of the future? How can we do that?
I think that will be extremely hard in the coming months and years, actually. I think there seems to be a big sort of a zeitgeisty push towards self-sufficiency, you know, global supply chains, particularly linked with China, being inherently a bad thing. So that kind of security versus freedom argument is going to be a difficult one for us to make, but make it we should. It means cheaper goods for people. And I think if you could tell those human stories about people on sort of lower or average incomes having extraordinarily better lives than, say, you know, 20 years ago or whatever it is, thanks to embracing global markets in the way that economies like ours have, then we can hopefully win that argument. But it is about stories. I think the left are generally better than us at telling stories. And that's not because we don't have good stories to tell. It's just that we sometimes get wrapped up in the data and treasury models. Like I was talking about in my opening remarks. Why didn't I tell a story? We need to tell better stories, I think, in order to make those arguments.
Now we have a question from someone called Eamon Butler, who I think is pulling rank by claiming to be a co-founder of the Adam Smith Institute. And he points out that revenues rose in America with the Coolidge, Kennedy, Reagan, and Bush tax cuts, and asks Grover first, is there a lesson for America in that history? And then he asks Peter Lilly, is there a lesson for Britain? So Grover, you first.
Absolutely. Look, the Republican Party learned that lesson during the Reagan years. They looked back and the supply side advocates said, look at what happened in the 20s when we cut rates. Look what happened in the 30s when we increased rates. Then when we cut rates in the 60s, you had growth. When we raised taxes in the 70s, everything went to Hades. We cut taxes in the 80s, things did better. You can see actual periods between tax cuts doing really well and tax increases slowing economic growth. And amazingly, Goldwater, the big conservative Republican icon, voted against the Kennedy tax cuts. So he didn't get it at the time. Today, all Republicans understand the importance of reducing tax rates for growth. Democrats try and rewrite history. They don't like to hear it because they need the cash. But Republicans win when they speak to independents as well as Republicans. We've convinced one party that tax cuts mean growth and most independents. At some point, the Democrats may come along, but we've sold much of the country on that, and that's the Republicans have had the House and Senate for 2 out of every 3 years since 1994. Before that, it was 1 out of 15 years they had both houses of Congress. That was the year the Republicans all signed the pledge against raising taxes and kept it, and they've done it ever since. That was the tipping point for whether Republicans usually 2/3 of the time own Congress or almost never, 1 out of 15 years. I think it's correctly sold the party, and the party's largely sold the country. But if you invade Iraq and forget to leave, you can still lose elections.
Good. I'm going to go to Peter Lilly next, and to ask him, I'm going to ask Peter Lilly whether we could hope to get the same kind of popular support, at least in one party and the supporters of one party in Britain, that Grover says that has been established in America. Can we get, Peter, in Britain, a realization that tax cuts are beneficial for the whole economy and that actually they give governments more revenue as well? Can we get that message across?
I think we can. It's probably a bit more difficult here than in the United States, which was, after all, founded on revolt against paying the tax on tea, I seem to remember, stamp duty on tea. But we can get it across. And I mentioned back in the days when top rate of earned income tax was 83%, and we promised to cut it and said, look, it will stop pop stars going abroad and income going abroad, and instead we'd have the investment here. It was a popular policy. I can remember trying it out in Tottenham High Street, which was one of the poorest areas of London, and people said, "Yeah, of course, cut taxes. Yeah, cut it on the rich, and then there'll be more for us." People can understand it, but you've got to put it positively. Having written that original speech, when I became, I think 8 or 9 years later, Economic Secretary of the Treasury, I went through every tax where we had cut the top rate to a maximum of 40%. And in every case, the revenue had gone up. So it worked. In fact, it worked even on death duties, the revenue had gone up. So we'd obviously encourage people to die or to leave lots of money to the state when they did. Perhaps they just spent less time trying to avoid tax a bit when it's at low rates than when it was at punitive rates.
Look, we've had lots of questions from several contributors on one particular subject, which is the generation game. Loads of money has been borrowed. We've made commitments into the future. Are we putting too much on the next generation of people? The millennials are going to have to pick up the tab. The present generation, the baby boomers, are going to get the benefits now, and their children and grandchildren are going to pick up the tab in the future. I think I might ask John to start on that. How do we actually address the problem that there might be a little bit of unfairness in this generation thing? Have you views on that?
I think the very first thing to do, actually this again was in that leaked Treasury document, would be to look at the triple lock on the state pension, which guarantees that it increases by 2.5% inflation or earnings, whichever's highest out of those three. One proposal not too long ago said that just making it double lock and would save at least $6 billion a year. But I think more than
which one would you eliminate of the triple lock?
I think the double lock proposal from the Social Market Foundation got rid of the 2.5%.
Right.
But I think as much as the money saved, I think it would be an indication that to the younger generations that they had taken a lot of pain in this period and will do in the future as well with higher taxes to pay off the debts in order to save a vulnerable group during a public health crisis as much as anything else. So that could be one practical step you could take. But I absolutely would sympathize with younger generations that are worried about sort of 300 billion going onto public sector net borrowing for an enormous deficit that they're going to have to pay off in the future. So some practical steps in those areas would be welcome.
Okay, we've got some questions again coming in from several people on migration. In both the US and the UK, we seem to be making it harder for people to migrate, to choose where they want to live and work. And many people take the view that for some migrants, there's a huge economic gain to the countries they go to by their presence. Is there a case for going for freer movement? Who would you start on this? Grover, would you like to have a go on this first of all?
Yes, absolutely. Look, when President Trump talks about America first and wanting to focus on American growth, much immigration increases jobs in the United States. All of the high-tech people who love to come here and go to university and would like to stay and create businesses here, we should have them stay. We should be delighted to have them stay. Why would you want somebody to go back to India and create a company in India to compete with America? You want them here. The countries used to go and kidnap people and bring them across borders to have more population and more talent. All the Americans and the Brits have to do is open the doors and talent flows. Coal used to be important. Oil used to be important. Talent is important in this economy. You want talent and individuals. You bring a chef over, you create jobs for everybody at the restaurant. You bring a great architect over, you bring jobs for all sorts of people who build. Talent is of value, and we ought to figure out a way to make it easy for people to come and stay and work. and become citizens. It's good for the economy. It's good for everyone.
Okay. Yeah. John, do you have a view on that?
I agree with everything that Grover said. Just to add for the British dynamic at the moment is obviously leaving the European Union, where freedom of movement is ending, and having that sense of control. I'm not entirely convinced that this is all about lower or higher raw numbers of migrants coming into the UK. I think it's about the public perceiving the government to be in control of the situation and having something resembling a plan for it too. So I do agree with everything that Grover said, but I think that in the British context, we certainly need to be seen to be in control of the situation. And that could even mean higher migration. It could mean immigration, much more immigration from Canada, New Zealand, America, wherever else. But I think a semblance of control is important too.
I'm going to put Peter Lilly on the spot now, because I think a survey from the Entrepreneurs Network showed that of the entrepreneurial businesses in Britain, something like 50% are people who are second generation immigrants, people whose parents came here as immigrants, and their children now form something like 50% of the startup company. If I've got those figures wrong, someone can correct me, but it's roughly of that order. Peter, do you think there's a case for altering the immigration rules so that we can kind of bring in and attract talent and help to achieve growth?
Well, we can and do allow rules under which entrepreneurs and people bringing capital to start a business are allowed in. I think it's a perfectly reasonable case in a country like the United Kingdom, which is one of the most densely populated major countries in Europe, to want to restrict the numbers. And then we want to look at it systematically, which categories actually are economically beneficial, but in far smaller numbers, because we have tended to take the view that it's easier to import skilled labor than to train people ourselves. Take nurses, for example. Nobody knows. We turned away 30,000 applicants from our universities last year who wanted to train as nurses because it's easier for the NHS to import them from Southern Europe, the Philippines and elsewhere. Now that's 30,000 British people who are not fulfilling their ambition to become nurses. So we ought to have an immigration policy that says, if there is a shortage of some reason, we don't have people with a particular skill or can't expect to have it, then fair enough. But if it's a temporary shortage, we should accompany the right to bring people into the country for a period with a plan to train people domestically so that we don't become a sort of Wimbledon economy where we serve lettuce sandwiches and everybody else plays tennis.
Yes, we've got another question here that says, we're about to open up in both Britain and America. It begins to look as though we might be wanting to open up selectively in different parts of our countries at a different pace. Now, some states are opening up faster than others, as Grover pointed out in America. Is there a case perhaps for having the same happen in Britain? Peter, I wonder if I can ask you to come straight back on that. Is there a case for having different regions in Britain open up at different speeds, depending on the way they're handling the crisis?
Yes, if there are areas which have got a high rate of transmission still of the virus, and because they were sort of later in getting it and the impact of the lockdown hasn't had any the beneficial effect, arguably they should have the restrictions continue longer. In general, I'm in the business of looking for reasons for opening up rather than offering regions the right to not open up. But if the alternative is between the whole convoy moving slowly and allowing some regions to move faster, I go for the latter.
Grover, what's the status in America of that? Different states opening at different times?
They are. You're seeing Texas and Florida open more rapidly. I live in Washington, D.C., where the mayors, they're going to keep everything closed for another month. New Jersey, some of these other states, Michigan, there's a Democratic governor who doesn't seem to like the state, and she keeps shutting everything down. Her husband doesn't follow those rules, but she wants everyone else to. I think it's helpful to have different politicians making this decision, because part of it is the states are different, but certain governors are more risk averse than others. Certain legislatures are more risk averse than others. You'd never move anywhere if one guy was making the decision and he had some sort of European precautionary principle thing dragging him along. But because you can look to your side and see people in other states doing well, it's going to speed up the whole process. It not only allows it to happen at all, but it speeds it up, because the people who sit on it too long eventually will lose elections.
John, your turn on this one?
I found Gerard Lyons, near the start of the crisis, wrote a paper on a traffic light system for reopening the economy. It was obviously, Gerard Lyons is an economist, so it was very much based on economics. And he argued that opening up on a regional basis might not make that much of an economic impact in the UK, given that our economy is so heavily geared towards London and the southeast. And that's something to consider, that if we were to open certain regions, that it will be a blip on sort of the economic recovery. So if we want a genuine economic recovery, we need to look at London and the southeast, and probably the whole country entirely, as opposed to a regional approach.
Madsen, restaurants, barbershops, all of those local things are local, and they don't require the rest of the country to be in. I think you'll see a lot of small businesses flourish with regional openings, not necessarily steel mills, but smaller self-employed people, flower shops, barber shops, restaurants.
And don't forget, of course, pubs in Britain, a vital part of national morale. Now then, there's a question we've had, which is, it goes roughly like this. If you had to pick one or two taxes that we could now put on hold, either abolish or suspend, that would benefit small and medium enterprises, entrepreneurial startup businesses, the stuff we need to get the economy growing again into tomorrow, which would they be? Now we're going to ask the tax expert, John, first. Now, put you on the spot, John. Which one or two taxes would most help these small and startup enterprises in Britain? And then I'll ask Grover about America.
Employers' national insurance, the jobs tax, I'd get rid of that immediately, and business rates. They're the two that would, with changes or cuts to them, that would have a huge impact for small businesses up and down the country. So quite easily, they'd be top two in my list.
Grover, in America, what would your top priorities be?
All of the fees, federal and state and local, that particularly hit startups because they don't have the money to start with, and they've got ridiculous fees to get everything from permits to approvals to get going. And then in addition to that, the corporate income tax, just take it to zero.
Really? A rate of 0, yes?
Yes, zero.
You're winning me over, Grover, I have to say that. Peter, come on, you've got to pick. You've been at the coalface of tax cuts for many years. Which one or two, would most help small, medium, startup enterprises? Which one? Come on.
Well, it wouldn't directly impinge on many small businesses, but cutting stamp duty would create activity, which many small businesses would benefit from, because when people move house, they buy furniture, they employ builders and decorators, and that permeates through the economy. So that would be one. Like John, I'd also want to reduce the national insurance burden on employers, particularly small and new startups.
Right. Now, I think it's probably going to be our final question. Many people say you should never waste a good crisis, and we must use this one to make sure the state is more powerful, controls more of our lives, and takes more of our money than ever before. But some people think differently. And they are suggesting that one thing we must do after this is over is to make sure that companies like Amazon and Facebook be taxed fairly, by which they mean taxed more. Now, the question is this a good idea, and is it going to happen? Should we be trying to get more money out of these, shall we say, international firms? That they make their money in one place, they're registered in another. Grover, I'm going to have you go first on this. Are you a fan of Amazon and Facebook, and do you think they should be taxed to the hilt?
No, we shouldn't come up with new taxes on that. The advocates of doing that were for it last year, the year before, and the year after, and they'll be for it next year and the year after and the year after. Has nothing to do with the virus, has everything to do with, oh, look, excuse for a new tax increase. Let's hit somebody with money. As soon as those companies start losing money, they'll have an excuse to tax somebody else that has the money. They're always interested in taxing the money wherever it is, and we've been through that before. The idea of using an emergency to raise taxes in 1794, Madison wrote to Jefferson, President Jefferson, about the, quote, old trick, 200 years ago, the old trick of using every emergency to augment state power. So this problem is going to be with us a while.
Okay, Peter Lilly, would you like to have a comment on that? Peter?
Yeah, it's a big risk that people do want to raise taxes. We have to remember that it's not companies who pay taxes, it's individuals. It will be the customers, the employees, or the investors in those companies who ultimately pay taxes, and probably the customers. So it wouldn't be actually taking money away from some mythical entity. It will be taking it away from you and me and the woman next door. And for that reason, even if a shift in the balance of taxation between companies or between different activities would be sensible, it's an unwise political route to go on, because you end up charging more.
Excellent. John, finally. John, Tim Wurzel has a very good saying, which is at the end of every tax is a purse or a wallet. Some guy or gal has to produce money from a wallet or purse to pay that tax. It doesn't fall on companies, as Peter has just said. Do you think the likes of Amazon and Facebook should be taxed heavily?
I think that we will have these arguments forevermore until the day that we drastically simplify the tax system. The day when we have as few loopholes as possible, because we have a low, simple taxation system, we will continue to have this argument, and politicians won't be able to keep up with the laws that they set themselves. There'll be loopholes within them. They'll then be chasing their tails, and we'll have this discussion forevermore. When Amazon and Facebook are no longer the behemoths that they are, when we have new behemoths, we'll be asking to tax those behemoths. We'll be doing this forevermore until we simplify taxes. And the TPA released a report in 2012, which seems like a long time ago now, but it called for a low, simple, single income tax rate on income and distributed income, so that each flow of income is only taxed once. When you have a system like that with a few or close to zero loopholes, that's when you can stop having these discussions once and for all.
Okay, that's it. Over time, I've got to thank Grover Norquist, John O'Connell, and Peter Lilly. And I've also got to thank the hidden expert who's made all this possible, Matthew Lesh. And I have to announce that there's a next webinar coming on Tuesday, which is on the subject of innovation and features Matt Ridley and Anton Howes. And I hope you all tune into that one. Thank you all for contributing, and thank you all for watching. Good night.
Good night. Thank you.